Welcome to Unraveling Behavior, a science podcast from the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Hello, everyone. Today, we're exploring how birth order might influence our approach to risk. You've probably heard the stereotypes, like the oldest sibling being the responsible one and the youngest the daredevil. But are these just myths, or is there some truth to them? Joining us today to shed light on this question is Dr. Tomás Lejarraga. Tomás is originally from Argentina and has a PhD in management from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Currently, he lives on the island of Mallorca, where he is an associate professor at the University of the Balearic Islands. Tomás is an expert in risk-taking and in how our circumstances and experiences shape our approach to risk. Today, he will share insights into whether laterborn children are indeed more willing to take risks than their older siblings. And now, let's dive into my conversation with Dr. Tomás Lejarraga and learn about his findings. I'm very honored to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Sophia.
Well, to kick things off, what drew you to study the link between birth order and risk-taking? Was there a specific moment or a scientific finding that really sparked your interest?
Well, I'm generally interested in how people make decisions under risk and under uncertainty. And so one question you can ask is there such a thing as a risk preference? Or if there is, where does it come from? And so at the time when I was considering these questions, there was a study that came out by Renato Frey and other people at the University of Basel and at the institute here, the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, in which they had studied risk-taking exhaustively. They had a very large sample, and they asked people, they measured risk-taking in a variety of ways, and they made several important observations. But one of the observations they made is that risk-taking has the properties of a personality trait. And so if you're interested in the origins of risk-taking propensity or risk preference, and risk-taking is similar to a personality trait, then you can ask, where does personality come from? And part of the answer is hereditary. The other part is from the environment. And the family environment is a good candidate to explain how personality forms or shapes. At the time, this was what led me to be interested in how birth order influences risk-taking.
It's not entirely obvious for the general public how birth order might actually influence aspects of our personality. I mean, the connection is not entirely obvious. Could you explain the family dynamics, right? The mechanisms behind why birth order might influence risk-taking?
Yes. So the family dynamics model by Frank Salloway proposes the following: that siblings within the family compete for parental resources, for parental investment, such as care, attention, love, or even material resources. And so children compete, siblings compete, and they do so according to the family dynamics model. They do so in a similar way that organisms compete for resources in the natural environment. And how is this so? Well, the principle that applies in the competition for resources, according to Darwin's evolutionary theory, is the principle of divergence. So individuals, when they compete for the same resources, they will try to do so by differentiating themselves from one another. And so by doing so, they reduce rivalry. And so, according to the family dynamics model, children within the family compete for parental resources by according to the principle of divergence, they will differentiate themselves from one another gradually, occupying different niches within the family. So you may have, for example, that one of the siblings competes for academic achievement, for example, and gradually becomes the smart one, for example. And another sibling, to reduce direct competition, may choose or deploy a different strategy, may become the entertainer, for example. And maybe another sibling may find that those two niches are occupied and then explore and perhaps rebel, become the rebel of the family. And so the idea is that growing up under these family dynamics slowly and gradually shapes personality. This is the idea of the family dynamics model.
And what role does risk-taking take in these dynamics?
So the idea is that firstborns enjoy a time alone with his or her parents, and so has easy access to parental resources, has no competition. And so when another sibling comes along, another sibling enters the family, there is competition for resources. So the firstborn will tend to develop strategies that would be directed at securing the status quo. Strategies that safeguard the resources that this sibling already controls. Also, the firstborn is physically and intellectually more developed than the laterborn. And so the laterborn comes along, and that niche is occupied. And so this secondborn will have to explore for alternative ways of acquiring parental resources. And through this exploration, this secondborn will be more inclined to take risks.
So if I understand you correctly, the hypothesis that one can derive from this model is that laterborns will tend to take more risk, be inclined to take more risks than their older siblings.
Yes, that's the hypothesis. Firstborns tend to develop more conservative strategies, and laterborns tend to develop riskier strategies. And the more competition there is, the more it pays off to take risks, according to the family dynamics model.
And to clarify the terms, just before we proceed, we've been talking about laterborns. We haven't said lastborns. So my question for you is who are considered to be the laterborns? So could you just clarify the use of the term laterborn?
The way I'm using it now, and I've used it in my work, laterborns are non-firstborns. So we draw the distinction between being the first sibling in the family compared to any sibling that comes afterwards.
And is there in the context of this model, are any specific do any specific predictions exist about the role of middleborns?
Yes, according to Salloway, middleborns are special because, as I said at the beginning, the strategies that siblings deploy to compete depend on parental investment. And there's evidence that shows that middleborns receive less parental resources compared to firstborns, or lastborns. So middleborns are in slightly higher or face slightly more scarce resources than their first and lastborn counterparts. So they are expected to be slightly more prone, or particularly more prone to taking risks.
In your work, you treat middleborns and lastborns within the same category, and we call them laterborns, right? So that's how we will use also the term for the rest of our conversation.
Yes.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the study that you co-authored with Renato Frey, Daniel Schnitzlein, and Ralph Hertwig, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019. When you started this project, what was the state of the evidence concerning the effects of birth order on personality and risk-taking?
So first, there was an interest in birth order effects on personality. There's a long tradition that have looked at how birth order influences personality. But at the time, this was 2019, there had been a series of papers, of articles that has shown that birth order effects on a variety of personality traits were not there. There were no birth order effects on personality traits, and a very small effect on intelligence, with firstborns scoring very slightly higher than laterborns on intelligence. But according to the authors of that paper, the effect was so small that we should not pay attention to it. So this was the growing consensus for personality traits.
And that was about like 2015, if I'm not mistaken.
15, 16, yes.
But this is already contradicting earlier evidence.
Yes, the early evidence showed support for the family dynamics model. The growing consensus in around 2015 addressed a number of methodological weaknesses that were present in previous studies, and the new evidence pointed in the direction of no effects on personality traits. This was the consensus in 2015 with respect to personality traits generally. With respect to risk-taking, the evidence was mixed. There was one article that has shown in a meta-analysis, an analysis of several articles published. This evidence showed that laterborns tend to choose sports that were considered more risky than firstborns. And this study also showed that if you take siblings that play baseball, laterborns tend to play the game in a more risky way.
And this is really real data.
This is real data. And so there is this evidence favoring birth order effects on risk-taking in line with the family dynamics model, with laterborns taking more risk than firstborns. And there was another study, mostly based on personality traits, but included a measure of risk-taking. And this other study, based on a very large sample, showed that there was no birth order effect on a measure of risk-taking that was self-reported. So in this study, people report how much of a risk-taker they think they are.
They answer a question.
On a scale from 0 to 10. And so the evidence was mixed. One study showing strong support for the family dynamics model, the other study showing no support, and using different measures, suggesting that perhaps the measure has an influence on whether we observe birth order effects or not.
In one case, you have actual choice, of sports, right? And in the other case, you have answers to questions.
To a question, yeah.
So these mixed findings, as I understand you correctly, they provided the starting point for your study. And what I would like to ask you is, were you, from the beginning, committed to a certain outcome? Did you have an expectation about what you were going to find?
For us, it was more of an open question, because there were results coming from the meta-analysis clearly showing birth order effects for risk-taking, and results that were not consistent. So it was more of an open question. And so we tried to address the problem in the best way we could, to see what the data was going to say about that question.
So you didn't have like a specific intuition as to whether you would observe an effect or not?
Well, there was a strong tradition of birth order effects. So I think we were, even though it was an open question, there was some expectation that we would observe birth order effects.
Could you walk us through the methodological approach that you used in the study, and also define briefly the different measures of risk-taking that you used? And I'll suggest that we'll define them briefly and then go more into detail later.
Okay, so I think the one strength of this research is that we looked at 3 different sources of data. So we looked at a large survey in Germany. We also looked at data from the Basel-Berlin risk study that used a variety up to 39 measures of risk-taking, including behavioral measures. That means, well, we will go into detail later, but these were choices with monetary consequences for the participants. And then we also looked at choices, at real life choices of risky activities.
And the third measure was?
So those 3. Survey data, the survey answers that were self-reports. Then the Basel-Berlin risk study that included self-report measures, but also behavioral measures. And then data from risky real-life activities.
And these were, if I understand you correctly, these were adult samples?
These were adult samples, yes.
Your analysis used... besides these measures of risk-taking, you also had, of course, to use an indicator of whether an individual is a firstborn or a laterborn.
Exactly. For each data, we knew whether the respondent or the participant was a firstborn or a laterborn.
And were there any other variables that you also entered in your analysis?
Yes, and this is important because we had important control variables such as age, gender, socioeconomic status of the family. We had an important variable, which is the sibship size, the number of siblings within the family, and other variables as well, such as the separation between the spacing between siblings, and so on.
And were you comparing siblings within families, or was it also across families?
In the survey, we did both between and within family analysis. For the Berlin-Basel risk study, these were between family analysis, and for the study of real-life risky activities, this was between families. Yeah.
Let's then talk about the first class of measures, the self-reports that came from the surveys. What sort of questions were used to elicit the individual's own assessment of their propensity to take risks?
Okay, so this data came from the German socioeconomic panel, and this is a very large survey in Germany, household survey in Germany with a long tradition. And in this survey, many questions are asked, of course, but there's one that is the one we used that asks the respondent how much of a risk taker the person is. And so I think the exact wording is, how do you see yourself? Are you generally a person who avoids risks, or do you like to take risks? And then respondents use a scale that goes from 0, that is labeled as risk averse, to 10, that is labeled as fully prepared to take risks. And so participants tick some point in that scale. And this was the general risk item. There were also self-reports about risk in particular domains of life, such as risk regarding financial activities, driving, leisure activities, and social activities.
And health as well, right?
And health.
It's also health, yes. Yeah.
And this is the data. And of course, we knew whether the person was a firstborn or a laterborn.
And did you also, I know there are some studies that have done this, did you also assess the frequency with which people engage in certain risky activities, like how often they smoke, how many cigarettes a day they smoke, for instance?
Yes, this was part of the Basel-Berlin risk study. Some questions were directed at getting at the frequency of engaging in risky activities, such as smoking, gambling, encounter with risky activities in general. So there were frequency measures that were essentially asked how, in the last 12 months, how many times did you engage in risky activity?
Now, this is a very rich data set because we've called them like self-reports, you've called them survey data, but even within this category, you have a variety of answers, right? You mentioned the general risk-taking question, assessing risks in specific domains of life, and then the frequency with which people engage in different risky activities. So this is a very rich data set. Very curious. What did the responses reveal?
So what we observed is that there were no differences in the answers between firstborns and laterborns. There was no difference in risk-taking between firstborns and laterborns. So there were no birth order effects on risk-taking in this.
For none of these questions that you just described?
No.
Do you think people might say, well, these are just questions people can answer whatever they like? Could it be that you didn't find birth order effects because people didn't answer accurately? Do scientists know how people address these type of questions?
That's possible. So we know that some people find answering these questions difficult. We know that responses tend to avoid extremes or maybe cluster at the middle. Even so, for example, the general risk item from the German socioeconomic panel has been shown to be a very good and reliable measure of risk-taking. So it gives us a signal. Maybe it is not a perfect measurement, but it gives us, it carries information.
And have scientists ever asked people what they're thinking when they answer these questions? How do they come up with a number?
Okay, so one reason for why this measure is useful and reliable is because apparently what people do to answer these questions is look into their memory and essentially retrieve the instances of their previous risk-taking activities and report based on that information. And that makes the measure relatively stable because those memories are unlikely to change drastically from one year to another. And this is a recent study by people from this institute that was very, very interesting to get at the reasons why such a simple measure can be useful.
Yeah, it draws on people's experiences, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Let's now turn to the second class of measures, the actual choices that people make in lab experiments. Now, I'd like to ask you, how do these experiments work and what do they reveal about risk-taking?
These experiments were conducted in the Basel-Berlin risk study, and the authors of that study tried to measure risk-taking in the most encompassing way that was possible at the time. It was the largest study known to me at the time. And so they used a variety of measures of risk-taking that were validated and that were used by other researchers, that they had a tradition. And so these were known, well-validated measures of risk-taking. So to give you an example, one of them is the balloon analog risk task. So here is a task in which the participant sits in front of the computer screen and sees a balloon, and by clicking on a button, the balloon inflates, and the more the participant inflates the balloon, the more money accumulates in a temporary account, and whenever the participant wants to stop, can stop and cash the money he has accumulated by clicking. The thing is, the more you click, the more likely it is that the balloon bursts, and if the balloon explodes, the participant loses the
Sounds
money
like fun.
in the temporary account. So the point is, the more a person inflates the balloon, the more of a risk-taking propensity this person would reveal. This is one task. Other tasks involved choosing between gambles. So, for example, do you prefer 3 euros for sure, or do you prefer to play a gamble in which you might win 4 euros with 80% chance, or nothing otherwise? And so participants would choose. If they chose 3, they were paid 3 euros. But if they chose a gamble was played. And if the outcome was 4, then this person would take 4 euros home. Or if it was 0, this person would not get anything. So what is interesting about these measures of risk-taking is they have consequences. They not just answer questions like in the other study. So these are choices with consequences.
And just to clarify this for our audience, so there's no right or wrong, right? There are no right or wrong answers, and your performance will determine your payoff when you leave the lab and go home. But this is then determined by a chance component and not really by the accuracy of your choices, right? This is correct.
This is not about accuracy, it's about preference.
Preference. And you examined people's risky choices in 9 experiments, right, that are part of the Basel-Berlin study. Did laterborns make riskier choices than firstborns?
No. Essentially, the answer is no. There was no difference between firstborns and laterborns in those behavioral tasks.
You included we were talking about this earlier. In both your analysis of the self-reported data and in your analysis of the behavioral measures, you included additional variables. Like you mentioned age, gender, the number of siblings, the spacing between siblings. Did any of these variables play a role?
They had no. We essentially did not observe any birth order effects in these two studies. So none of these variables were related to whether we would observe birth order effects or not.
So overall, we can summarize the result as laterborns take as much risk as firstborns in the behavioral measures and report as much willingness to take risk as their older siblings.
Yes, in adults.
That's the samples we're talking about. Then we still have a third measure of risk-taking that you use, which concerned risky life choices. You analyzed a data set, right, of historical figures who took significant risks. Who are these people? Who are these figures?
So these are famous explorers and revolutionaries. So we looked at exploration and joining a revolution or starting a revolution as two risky life decisions. And so what we did was we took a bibliometric approach. What we did is instead of choosing which explorers to look at by coming up with somewhat maybe from memory which explorers are important to look at, what we did was we took 3 encyclopedias that listed explorers, and then we looked at the explorers that appeared in the 3 sources. So we looked at the intersection of explorers from these three sources. And when we had this subset of explorers that we were going to look at, we started a search of their birth order and their sibship size, the number of siblings in the family. So we collected these 2 pieces of data: the number of siblings in the family and the rank of the person in that sibship. And we did the same analysis for revolutionaries. So, for example, some explorers are Alexander von Humboldt, appears there. Then Hillary, the first person to summit Everest. Yuri Gagarin, for example. These are among the explorers, and among the revolutionaries we have Rosa Luxemburg, Mao, Che Guevara, Pancho Villa, all very interesting characters, and we had to go into essentially biographies and trying to get these 2 pieces of information.
And were explorers and revolutionaries more likely to be laterborns than firstborns?
So what we observed was that explorers and revolutionaries are not more likely to be laterborns. They showed the birth rank that you would expect if there are no birth order effects. So we didn't observe birth order effects across the three analyses that we conducted.
So at this point, perhaps our audience will start wondering. So we have here a podcast episode that so far has only covered null results. I think might be a good moment to explain why null results are so important in scientific research.
Okay, I think this is a good question. And results, whether they are null or not, never stand alone, I think. They always speak to our expectations. Whether a result is interesting or has more or less scientific value relates to how it relates to the expectations. So I often tell my students If you go out and take a representative sample of the world population and you measure heights and you observe that men are not taller, there's no significant difference between men and women, or men's and women's heights, then this is a very interesting outcome, because the expectation is that men are taller than women. There you have a null result that may lead you to reconsider what are the selection pressures on physiological development, for example. And so in the context of birth order effects, as I said at the beginning, for us the question was a little bit open, but there was interest in the community because a tradition of birth order effects, of effects that were for which there was evidence. The recent consensus was that those effects were not really there. So when we conducted this study, there were high expectations about what we were going to observe, and so we observe a pattern of results that speaks in favor for no birth order effects. But again, we're looking at an adult sample.
So when you find mostly null results, no effect, this triggered a deeper inquiry, right? So how did you then proceed from that?
So one question you can ask is, after you see no birth order effects, is why? And why some people do. Why some studies show birth order effects on risk-taking, and why didn't we?
We were talking about the study about the choice of sports,
for example. And so when you look at that study, in the choice of sports was moderated by age, showing stronger effects of birth order on sports choice for younger respondents than for older respondents. So age had something to do with the matter, and so we hypothesized that perhaps what happens is that siblings engage in the family dynamics hypothesized by Salloway. They behave in accordance to the theory while they are subject to the competitive pressures of the family. But an element of the family dynamics model is that these dynamics shape personality. And since personality is a relatively stable construct, then you should expect to see differences in adulthood. Our hypothesis was that, well, perhaps these dynamics occur in the household, but children don't carry those strategies once they leave the home environment, so that they behave differently in a different environment. And there was some evidence by Harris suggesting this, what we call context-specific learning hypothesis. What Harris had shown was that children behave differently at home than in school. So reports from parents and reports from teachers tend to differ. So here we have children that are able to adapt their behavior to the particular domain they are in. So our hypothesis was that maybe that's happening for risk-taking, so that children exhibit birth order effects when they are subject to the family dynamics, but they stop showing those or deploying those strategies when they leave the family environment. And so the hypothesis was, if age is a proxy for whether the respondents are within the family environment or not, then we should expect to see birth order effects among young respondents, among children, and expect that those effects wash away as children transition out of the home and disappear in adulthood, as we observed in the study that we just discussed.
This was the hypothesis that you tested in an article that you published earlier this year, an article you co-authored with Daniel Schnitzlein, Sarah Daman, and Ralph Hertwig. And this is a study that was published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. Could you guide us through the methodological approach that you used in the study?
What we did after posing this hypothesis, the possibility that birth order effects emerge at home but disappear when siblings transition out of the family environment, we went back to the data from the German socioeconomic panel, and we looked at whether there was data available for younger cohorts, for respondents that were in an age range that we could consider being at home. And we observed that there was this data available. And so what we were able to do was to sort of replicate the original analysis, but for different age samples. And so we have data for respondents starting at 13, and then on to several other samples until they match the age of the respondents of the original study. This was one source of data. Maybe I tell you what we observed there, and then we move to the other source of data. Sure. So what we observed there was that indeed birth order effects appeared as we expected for the youngest respondents.
And these are answers to questions.
These are again self-report measures, to the general risk item from the socioeconomic panel. So this is an answer to the question: how do you see yourself? Are you a person that likes to avoid risks or to take risks? This was the answer. And and by the way, it is important that these are children self-reporting, because there are studies of children, of birth order effects in children, but it's often the parents judging the risk-taking propensity or the personality of their children. And so we were looking for data that it was the children themselves who were providing the answer. Essentially, what we observed was that the effects were emerged very clearly for young samples and disappeared as siblings transitioned out of the home, and for the samples that were as old as the adult sample that we examined before, then the effect disappears. So essentially, we found support for the context-specific learning hypothesis, the idea that there are birth order effects when siblings are in an age that are subject to the family dynamics, but the effects disappear when they are at an age suggestive that they have left the home. And so that was data from the German socioeconomic panel, but we said, let's look for some other data to see if we can validate what we observe.
Thinking that there might also be differences, right, between different data sets or even between countries.
Exactly. And so we looked for a data set that met these criteria, that we had children in the sample, that it was children themselves given the response, that it was that we had samples of different ages from childhood into adulthood, and we found we used a longitudinal survey from the US that met these criteria. And we did the same analysis and observed the same pattern of results. And here the sample started at 10, and what we observed was that birth order effects were very clear at young ages and slowly vanished as siblings transitioned out of the home environment.
do these results imply that birth order effects are in some sense a response to children's current circumstances?
Yes, that's one way of putting it. What we observe is that children are responding to the competitive dynamics within the home, and when competition, when rivalry decreases, then laterborns do not. It doesn't pay to them to continue to take risks. And so, yes, I think this is evidence for how much the environment influences risk-taking.
The parents that will watch or listen to this episode might now be wondering, but wait, so my children have different willingness to take risks, and that is because they are competing for my attention, for my resources. Could you, Tomás, speculate what you think parents should do in light of these findings? Should they try to counteract birth order effects on risk-taking, or should they instead leverage those effects in children?
Yeah, so this is a difficult question that you're asking me. I think first, parents cannot make an environment that is equivalent for their children, because there are differences that will always exist. So, for example, when the firstborn joins the family, parents are first-time parents, and they have very little experience. They have a lot of time to devote to the firstborn child. And this changes when the secondborn comes along. So now attention is divided. Parents have more experience. Parents are older. And so it would be very difficult to try to minimize the environments that parents offer their children to grow up in. That's one reason why I see difficult that parents try to undo birth order effects by equating the environment. The other idea that comes to mind is that the home is a good environment to learn to compete, and outside the home there is competition in many domains of life. Not in every domain of life, but in many significant domains of life. And so learning to compete relatively safely at home, it's a good learning environment. It's a kind learning environment. So I think parents do what they can. And I think my suggestion is not to do anything about it.
Going back to your research on birth order effects on risk-taking, does your work have any methodological limitations that you think is important for our audience to know of?
Yeah, this is a good point. Our research is focused mainly, actually, it uses a Western sample of individuals, of respondents, of participants. And there is some indication that birth order effects could also be influenced by culture. So to have a better understanding of how birth order affects, how birth order influences risk-taking, but also other personality traits, it's important to look at different cultures, not only at Western industrialized cultures. So that is one of the limitations. And it's another way to see it is this is a first evidence of the context-specific learning hypothesis and risk-taking, and it is interesting to continue to examine this this pattern of results and see how and to what extent it is observed in other samples.
Maybe this episode will bring your research to scientists, right? Working in different cultures and potentially foster collaborations.
That would be great.
And create opportunities for looking at cross-cultural differences, right? Are there still unresolved questions about birth order, effects on risk-taking that you would be interested in examining in the future beyond this idea of the cross-cultural comparisons?
What we learned in this last maybe eight years studying in this problem is that there are strong intuitions in the adult population about birth order effects. And so we observed that there are no birth order effects in adulthood, but people have strong intuitions. And this is one reason why these two papers drew a lot of attention. For many, the observation that there were no birth order effects in adulthood was a bit counterintuitive. So we by talking to lay people about our research, we sense there are strong intuitions about how birth order influences personality. So one aspect of the problem that we would like to look at is whether to document whether those intuitions are indeed there, whether people do indeed have strong intuitions about birth order effects. That's one interesting aspect. The other is that what this research is suggesting is how much the environment influences behavior, how much the environment influences risk-taking. And if we think about the environment that the firstborn and the secondborn sibling encounters, it is possible that firstborn and secondborns learn about the world in slightly different ways. So, for example, firstborns, because they have their parents' undivided attention, tend to receive, or this is a hypothesis, may tend to receive more instructions from parents, while secondborns, or maybe even laterborns, that encounter a home with parents having less time, they may be more prone to learn from experience and to receive less instruction, at least from the parents. So here we have a possibly distinct way of acquiring knowledge about the world that is a function of birth order. And so this is another interesting aspect that I think about.
Very interesting. I think you should pursue that. To conclude our conversation, Tomás, a difficult question. What impact do you hope to make in your field as you continue to progress in your career?
So I think what this research shows, and also other research that I have conducted based on how people learn from experience, is how much the environment influences the extent to which people take risks. And so I hope this research contributes to that view, to the view that the environment is critical to how people learn and behave. We often, as we study risk-taking, we tend to look at determinants of risk-taking behavior within the mind, and we often do not consider, we don't give enough relevant credit to how much the environment, the structure of the environment, or the conditions in the environment influence how people behave. And so I think this work points in or makes us think how much the environment influences siblings' risk-taking. But I think it speaks to the larger problem, which is often risk-taking is a response to the learning conditions and to the environments that people find themselves in. So that's the impact I would like this work to have.
Tomás, as we conclude, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your expertise. It's been a pleasure having you. I'd like to wish you all the best for your future research, for your career, and beyond.
Thank you very much, Sophia.
Dear audience, thanks so much for tuning in to today's discussion with Dr. Tomás Lejarraga. For show notes and additional resources concerning this episode, visit our website at unravelingbehavior.org. We don't monetize this podcast. Our goal is solely to make scientific knowledge accessible to everyone. So if you enjoyed today's conversation with Dr. Tomás Lejarraga, please share this episode. It's a simple way to help us bring scientific knowledge to more people. Thanks for your support and your interest in science. See you soon.